war had become a slow, crushing inevitability. Humanity's fleets, once a symbol of their relentless ambition, now drifted in tatters across the void. Every engagement, every maneuver, every desperate last stand had been undone by the same unseen hand. The Althari Dominion had no need for overwhelming firepower or brute force. Their true weapons were far more insidious. Psychological warfare, deception, and an unfailing ability to predict every human move before it was even made. They were predators of the mind, architects of destruction, who never fought battles they weren't certain they could win. Across the scattered colonies of Earth's fragile empire, fear had taken root. Resistance flickered, leaders wavered, and even the most stalwart warriors began to wonder if there was any path left that did not lead to annihilation. No, but not all accepted defeat. Captain Elias Vance had built a reputation not on brute force, but on defying expectations. Where others followed established doctrines, he saw flaws waiting to be exploited. Where others viewed strategy as a rigid science, he treated it as an evolving puzzle. His superiors called him reckless, his enemies called him dangerous. He called himself a survivor. The Althari had mistaken humanity's unpredictability for incompetence. They had mistaken adaptability for desperation, and now they had made the greatest mistake of all. They had assumed they understood him. For centuries, the Althari had played their games of deceit and subterfuge, weaving wars like a master artist constructing a grand design. Their war algorithms, powered by quantum AI, absorbed data across countless encounters, simulating every possible outcome, ensuring that no enemy could outmaneuver them. Other species had tried and failed to challenge their supremacy, falling not to superior weaponry, but to the slow erosion of hope. To them, humanity was no different. The battle was already over. The final decisive act merely needed to play out as predicted. Soon, the last embers of resistance would be extinguished, and another species would be relegated to the archives of forgotten civilizations. Human command met in hushed voices, caught between desperation and resignation. Some argued for surrender. If the war could not be won, perhaps survival could be bargained. Others refused to kneel, though they lacked an alternative that wasn't simply prolonging the inevitable. Rumors of the Althari's final offensive spread like wildfire, a war-ending maneuver calculated to draw human forces into overextending themselves one last time. And as the whispers grew louder, so did the feeling that this was not just another battle. It was the end. That was when the transmission arrived. A coded burst, intercepted by a rogue intelligence team operating beyond the edges of safe space. The data was garbled, fragmented, but unmistakable in its importance. The Althari had grown so confident in their victory that they no longer concealed their final moves. The battle was not just a trap, it was the trap. A carefully orchestrated sequence, a deception so perfect that it had no conceivable counter, unless someone conceived one. Vance stared at the data, not with despair, but with something far more dangerous: realization. The Althari's strategy was perfect, flawless, undeniable. It was, in every way, unassailable. And that was the flaw. They had crafted their deception based on the certainty that humanity would react as expected. They had sculpted their victory under the assumption that humans would fall into their roles, playing their part in an ending already written. But Vance had never been one for following scripts. He saw the gaps, the narrow windows of opportunity where the Althari had, without knowing it, left themselves vulnerable. If humanity was expected to fall into a trap, then the only path to victory was to play along, to pretend, to deceive the deceivers. The plan was simple in its madness. Humanity would give the Althari exactly what they expected. They would fall into the trap, They would react as predicted. They would follow every step outlined in the Ulthari's grand design. And in doing so, they would lull their enemy into the deepest sense of control. And then, in the moment of presumed victory, they would strike. Vance's proposal was met with skepticism. The War Council was filled with officers who had seen the Ulthari's omniscience firsthand. Outmaneuvering them was one thing, outwitting them at their own game was another entirely. Impossible, some said. They've spent centuries perfecting deception. But that was the key. The Ulthari had perfected deception against species that played by the rules. They had mastered manipulation against those who believed in the rigidity of logic and predictability. They had never faced a species willing to embrace chaos. Vance's voice was unwavering. They believe they've already won. That is their weakness. Doubt still lingered. The risks were immeasurable. If they were discovered too soon, if the Ulthari realized the trap within the trap, then humanity's extinction would follow in days, not months. But there was no other way. There was no alternative left that did not end in surrender or death. The War Council wavered, then relented. The plan was approved. Time was short. The pieces had to be moved swiftly and with absolute precision. The illusion of failure had to be complete. Every retreat, every decision, every battle had to convince the Ulthari that humanity was playing into their hands. And so the seeds of reversal were sown. Humanity would give the Ulthari their grand victory. And then, when they reached out to claim it, they would find nothing but a blade in the dark. The transmission came through in broken pulses, garbled fragments of data stitched together from deep space intercepts. It carried the signature of the Ulthari, precise, calculated, devoid of unnecessary redundancy. The humans who recovered it knew immediately what they had found. High Command wasted no time in decrypting the message, but when the final patterns emerged, a chilling certainty settled over the War Council. The Ulthari had engineered their final gambit. They had predicted the last moves of the war, anticipated the desperate plays that humans would make when pressed to the brink. The trap had been constructed long before humanity even saw the battlefield. Every weakness, every psychological tendency, every tactical response had been accounted for. The Ulthari's quantum warfare AI had woven the perfect snare, a scenario in which humanity would stumble into a decisive conflict, believing themselves in control, only to be annihilated in a single sweeping maneuver. The battle's outcome was already written, the pieces arranged. The humans simply had to walk into their fate. Many among the High Command whispered the word surrender. But Elias Vance saw something else. Where others saw inevitability, he saw a weakness so fundamental that even the Ulthari's machines had overlooked it. They had not planned for failure. They had not even considered the possibility that their trap might be a trap itself. Arrogance had been coded into their logic, overconfidence baked into their simulations. In their pursuit of total control, they had left themselves blind to a singular truth. Humanity did not obey predictions. The War Council met in tense silence. The intercepted strategy was perfect, flawless in its execution, and that was why Vance refused to accept it at face value. There was no room in Ulthari doctrine for true improvisation. Their strategies relied on calculation, pattern recognition, control. A species that functioned on deception could not anticipate one simple human concept: the refusal to follow the script. The argument unfolded in clipped voices, hushed and heated. It was too clean, too precise. It was bait, a poisoned lure, a false hope dangled before a desperate species. Some saw it as a last warning that the war was already lost. Others, including Vance, saw an opportunity. If the Ulthari were so certain of their victory that they no longer concealed their plans, then the real victory lay in making them believe they were right. He laid out the idea, calm and deliberate. Humanity would take the bait. They would enter the battlefield exactly as the Ulthari expected. following the course of the war with perfect, fatal precision. They would play their role, feigning predictable desperation, mirroring every calculated maneuver that the Ulthari had scripted. But behind the illusion, something else would take shape. Human forces would remain hidden, out of reach of the Ulthari's surveillance webs. Stealth ships would deploy, silent and invisible, positioning themselves where the enemy's gaze did not linger. Saboteurs would move unseen through their networks, disrupting supply chains, slicing through communication relays. When the moment came, the Ulthari would not just lose. They would never even understand how it had happened. Dissent cracked through the war room. Some called it suicide. If the Ulthari so much as suspected deception, the counter-scheme would unravel before it could take root. The risk was not just annihilation, but total and immediate erasure. But the alternative was far worse. If they did nothing, if they fought on the Ulthari's terms, then extinction was not a matter of if, but when. And so, humanity prepared to play the longest con in the history of war. The battle began as the Ulthari had planned. Human forces engaged at the expected coordinates, their movements aligning with projections. They retreated where the Ulthari anticipated, struggled against the calculated pressure, hesitated at precisely the right moments. The Dominion's commanders watched from their vessels with absolute certainty. Every element of the simulation was unfolding as it should. Meanwhile, in the unseen spaces of the battlefield, the real war was beginning. Human stealth ships drifted through sensor gaps, threading the needle between detection grids. They moved like shadows, slipping into position around supply corridors and command networks. Sabotage teams breached Ulthari systems, not with brute force, but with the quiet, methodical patience of predators. Supply routes faltered, communications lagged. Tiny, imperceptible flaws began creeping into the Ulthari's flawless execution. They dismissed them as anomalies. The Ulthari did not realize they were being played. Vance watched from the bridge as the enemy continued to push forward, their confidence swelling with each predicted movement. Their war analysts fed battle data to the Dominion's AI, recalibrating its expectations in real time. But they saw only what they were meant to see. They never noticed the hesitation in human responses was deliberate. They never questioned why the retreating ships lagged just slightly off pattern, why distress signals arrived a fraction of a second too late. They never asked why, when they pushed forward to finish the kill, they always found humanity's defenses just slightly weaker than anticipated. They mistook it for crumbling morale. In truth, they were being led. As the final phase of their grand deception neared, the Ulthari committed their fleets fully, closing in for what they believed would be the last strike of the war. Their forces spread wide, encircling the battlefield, preparing to deliver the decisive blow. Vance watched, waiting. The moment arrived. A second too soon. A final maneuver played a beat too confidently. The trap had been sprung. The Ulthari had overextended. The order came in a whisper. Across the void, human warships emerged from nothingness. The hidden fleet surged forward, breaking the illusion, striking not at the Ulthari's forces, but at their logistics. Their AI networks collapsed under cyber warfare. Supply chains severed, reinforcement nodes shattered. 1,000 minor failures, dismissed as meaningless, now coalesced into a single, inescapable reality. The Ulthari had walked into their own trap. Panic rippled through the enemy fleet. The Dominion's war engines, designed for cold, calculated engagement, found themselves stripped of their greatest weapon, certainty. They faltered, hesitated, searched frantically for explanations that did not exist. They had miscalculated. Vance leaned forward, eyes fixed on the enemy fleet unraveling before him. "They think they've already won," he murmured. "That's when we strike." The retreat unfolded as expected. Human ships peeled away in chaotic clusters, their formations breaking apart under carefully measured pressure. The Ulthari watched from the command decks of their dreadnoughts, their war analysts nodding in silent approval. This was how it always ended. The enemy collapsed, scattered, driven to the edges of desperation before being crushed. Every scan confirmed the projections. The human fleet was disorganized, predictable, incapable of withstanding the final blow. Their admirals scrambled, issuing frantic orders to salvage their crumbling defenses. The Ulthari's predictive AI registered it all, feeding data into the quantum matrices that dictated the flow of war. The outcome had been calculated long before the first shot was fired. But beneath the illusion of collapse, something far more dangerous was at play. Invisible to the Ulthari's all-seeing eyes, human forces moved with precision. Stealth ships drifted undetected through sensor gaps, slipping past enemy lines like phantoms. They watched, listened, waiting for the perfect moment. Across the sector, covert operatives worked in silence, dismantling supply routes and severing relay links with surgical efficiency. Entire sections of the Ulthari network began to strain under the weight of disruptions. Small, imperceptible at first, dismissed as battlefield noise. The Dominion's fleets pressed forward, unaware of the shadows closing around them. And still, the illusion held. The sacrifices had been calculated. Remote outposts were left vulnerable, their distress calls unanswered. Entire squadrons were ordered to fight losing battles, burning themselves out to preserve the greater deception. There were no reinforcements, no last-minute rescues. Every loss was a message written in blood. Humanity was failing. Dissent simmered among human officers. Some balked at the cost, their voices rising in anger. Was this what survival demanded? Was victory worth the price of condemning their own to die? But there was no room for hesitation. The moment they wavered, the moment doubt cracked through the lines, everything would unravel. The illusion had to be complete. If it worked, they won. If it didn't, humanity died. But humanity was not the only side facing an unseen war. The Ulthari had never been forced to question themselves. Their dominion had been built on the certainty of control. Wars ended the moment their enemies believed there was no path forward. But this war had not followed their expectations. It had stretched, strained, resisted in ways that defied reason. The humans should have collapsed long ago. Their desperation should have given way to surrender. He took calm, deep breath, and yet here they were, fighting, adapting, refusing to break. Doubt rippled through the Ulthari hierarchy. Some among their war councils began whispering unease. The simulations were perfect, and yet something felt wrong. The humans had not made a single unpredictable move, not deviated even once from the path laid before them. It was too perfect. But the AI dismissed the concerns. The data held. The humans were in free fall. There was no statistical evidence to suggest deception. The war was ending exactly as predicted. And so the Dominion committed. The final strike began, fleets shifting into position for the killing blow. It was a textbook maneuver, practiced across countless campaigns, the same sequence that had crushed civilizations before this one. The Ulthari surrounded their prey, tightening the noose, preparing to close the trap. Only then did they realize the prey had never been caught. Without warning, human warships broke from their scripted retreat, formations snapping into cohesion with impossible speed. Weapons arrays flared to life from positions the Ulthari had believed abandoned. Plasma fire erupted from stealth ships that should not have been there. Across the battlefield, Ulthari systems failed in rapid succession. Tactical networks collapsed, supply lines went dark. Entire dreadnoughts floated powerless, their commands lost to the void. The illusion shattered, revealing the true battlefield for the first time. Panic rippled through the Ulthari fleet. There was no counter-strategy, no recalculated maneuver to escape. The algorithms could not process the unfolding reality. Humanity had led them into their own trap. And then the final order came. We strike? The hidden fleets emerged in force, striking at the heart of the Ulthari armada. Engines roared as human warships surged forward, driving deep into enemy formations, tearing through the once invincible war machine with merciless efficiency. The Ulthari command grid, their greatest weapon, became their undoing. Corrupted data flooded their systems, feeding them false information, turning their own predictions against them. Their AI, once a flawless engine of war, now screamed contradictions into the void. Some Ulthari captains hesitated, paralyzed by indecision. Others tried to flee, only to find their escape routes had already been severed. And for the first time in history, the Dominion knew fear. What should have been their final victory had become their greatest failure. The battlefield, once their domain, now belonged to the humans. Their trap had sprung, but they had never realized who had been caught. The Ulthari surged forward, their fleets moving in perfect synchrony, guided by the cold precision of their war algorithms. The battle was already won. Humanity's resistance was crumbling, their retreat an inevitable march toward annihilation. The kill zone was closing. Victory calculations had already reached 99% certainty. Then the first anomaly appeared. A brief flicker in the data stream, a distortion along the outer rim of their encirclement. The war analysts dismissed it as battlefield interference, until it happened again, then again. Before they could react, the human fleets that had been fleeing for survival turned. Their formations, once chaotic and broken, shifted into deadly alignment. Stealth ships decloaked within the heart of the Ulthari's tactical grid, cutting off escape routes before the Dominion could even register the attack. Ion storms erupted from hidden flanking positions, slicing through the ranks of Ulthari warships. The algorithms screamed contradictions. The battle it had designed was unraveling before its synthetic mind. Panic gripped the Ulthari as human jamming signals spread across the battlefield, severing coordination, breaking apart the seamless flow of their attack. Fractures formed in the once impenetrable wall of their assault, confusion spreading like wildfire. The hunters had become the hunted. The Ulthari had always been masters of fear, their strategies built upon psychological pressure, calculated submission. The enemy was meant to see no path forward, no option but defeat. Humanity had learned well. Across the battlefield, distress calls crackled through the void, fabricated, but indistinguishable from the real. Ulthari warships received desperate pleas from their own fleets, messages reporting catastrophic losses that had never occurred. Sensor feeds were corrupted, enemy formations appearing where there were none, targets vanishing into static. One warship fired upon another, then another. The fractures deepened. It had taken centuries for the Ulthari to perfect psychological warfare. It had taken humanity only years to turn it against them. The chaos provided an opening, a single moment calculated to the millisecond. The strike team moved in. Breaching pods slammed into the hull of the Ulthari flagship, the elite warship that held the central command AI, the core of their entire strategy, the apex of their control. Elias Vance led the charge. The Ulthari had never expected their own technology to be wielded against them. Their security systems, designed to counter foreign infiltration, were helpless against human-engineered variants of their own encryption. The defenses fell one by one. Vance moved through the corridors with the relentless precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. The Ulthari, for all their strategic mastery, were unprepared for the chaos of close-quarters battle. They fought by prediction, by expectation. Humans fought like cornered beasts. The command chamber fell within minutes. Vance reached the core. The AI's presence radiated through the interface, a vast, pulsating network of strategic calculations, still recalculating its inevitable victory even as the Ulthari fleets crumbled outside. The system had seen every possible human response, every variation of resistance, every logical conclusion. It had not predicted this. With a single command, the core was severed. The Dominion's nerve center was gone. Outside, the Ulthari war machine buckled. Command chains collapsed. Entire fleets, still awaiting orders, were left adrift, uncertain. The retreat began, but for some, surrender was not an option. Warships, their commanders unwilling to accept failure, turned their weapons on human vessels, refusing to flee, refusing to bow. They fought with desperation, with fury. What had once been a strategic engagement dissolved into brutality. Flesh and metal torn apart in the void, ships bleeding fire as both sides suffered devastating losses. The battlefield became a graveyard. The war was ending, but no one felt victorious. The last Ulthari ships fled into the void. The remnants of the Dominion, once an empire of untouchable precision, now broken, scattered. Vance stood at the edge of the wreckage, watching. The cost was written across the stars. Ships reduced to drifting husks, thousands dead, more to follow. He had won. He had turned the enemy's greatest weapon against them. And yet, as he stared into the endless void, he could not shake the question that clawed at the back of his mind. Was this victory? The survivors whispered among themselves, glancing at the ruin left behind. Some celebrated, others grieved, and some, like Vance, remained silent. The Ulthari, once seen as invincible, now stood at the precipice of extinction. The choice was theirs. The remnants of their high command gathered, their arrogance shattered, their confidence gone. The war was lost. But some still clung to defiance, their hatred of humanity refusing to fade. Others, however, had seen the truth. Humanity had done the impossible. They had adapted. They had learned, and worst of all, they had beaten the Ulthari at their own game. Vance spoke the final words that would shape the future. This war ends now. Choose your next move wisely. The battle was over, but the silence that followed carried no peace. The void, once a battlefield teeming with fire and fury, had become a graveyard of shattered vessels and drifting wreckage. Human ships limped through the debris, flickering emergency beacons marking the remnants of a victory that had come at an unfathomable cost. Hulls torn open to the cold, airless abyss. Silent bridges where orders had once been shouted, the dead, untethered, lost to the dark. For every warship that remained, there were 10 that would never return home. Survivors moved through the aftermath in hushed reverence, their voices subdued by the weight of what had been won and what had been lost. Some colonies celebrated, their leaders proclaiming triumph, a momentous shift in the tides of history. But for those who had stood on the front lines, for those who had watched comrades vanish in blinding explosions, the victory felt hollow. The war had not ended so much as it had changed. The Ulthari, once unshakable, now stood fractured and uncertain. Their fleets had been scattered, their war machine crippled, their dominion over the stars no longer assured. Among them, fear festered. Not just fear of defeat, but fear of what had replaced them in the galactic order. Humanity had outmaneuvered the masters of deception, and now the galaxy watched. The whispers spread first, then the calculations, the adjustments. Other species, once dismissive of this upstart race from the fringes, reevaluated their assumptions. Humanity was no longer a footnote, no longer the desperate survivor of a war they were fated to lose. They had beaten the Ulthari. They had turned their own strategies against them, that made them unpredictable, dangerous. Some races saw inspiration in their victory, admiration for their resilience, their willingness to bend, break, and rebuild. Others, especially those who had long feared the Ulthari's reach, considered alliances, wondering if humanity might become a necessary counterbalance. But not all saw them as liberators. Some factions recoiled at what they had witnessed, at the ruthless efficiency with which humanity had taken the enemy's greatest weapon and wielded it as their own. The ability to adapt, to deceive, to learn. It was terrifying in its implications. There were already murmurs of vengeance. The Ulthari had been the first to underestimate humanity. They would not be the last. Elias Vance stood at the edge of it all, watching. Once dismissed as reckless, as a man who refused to follow the script of war, he was now hailed as a tactician beyond compare. His name spread across human space, a symbol of defiance, of ingenuity. His strategies would be studied, his victories immortalized in records that would be analyzed for generations. And yet, as he stared at the wreckage, none of it felt like triumph. He had done what was necessary. He had played the game as the Ulthari played it, had turned their own philosophy of war against them. But at what cost? Humanity had not simply defeated their enemy, they had become them. The war had forced them to learn how to lie, how to manipulate, how to strike in the places that hurt them most. They had perfected deception, the art of appearing weak when strong, of feigning loss while ensuring victory. The very tactics that had once made the Ulthari untouchable now belonged to humanity. But where did that path lead? Vance looked at his own reflection in the glass of the warship's viewport, and for the first time, he was not certain he recognized the man staring back. The Ulthari remnants, scattered and leaderless, faced a moment of reckoning. Some among them, those who had seen the writing on the wall, advocated for peace. They saw, perhaps for the first time, a kinship with their former enemy. Humanity had done what the Ulthari had always done, survived at any cost, adapted where others broke. Perhaps there was a way forward that did not lead to another war. Perhaps, even, humanity could be an ally. Others, however, saw only a rival that had taken everything from them. The war had not been lost, they argued. It had merely shifted. The battlefields would change, the weapons would evolve, but vengeance would come. Humanity had shown its hand, proven its cunning, and that meant it could never be trusted. The embers of hatred still smoldered, and the future was uncertain. But one truth remained. The Ulthari were no longer the architects of fate. The humans had rewritten the game. And as Vance turned away from the wreckage, he understood the full weight of what had happened. This war was over, but it had not been the end. It had only been the beginning. The echoes of war had not yet faded, but the galaxy had already changed. The shockwaves of humanity's victory rippled outward, reaching the farthest corners of the known universe. The Ulthari, once seen as the undisputed masters of deception and conquest, had fallen. Their empire, fractured and leaderless, left a void that demanded to be filled. The balance of power had shifted, but not in ways anyone had predicted. For those who had once dismissed humanity as an insignificant species clawing at the edges of galactic relevance, the illusion had been shattered. No longer were they viewed as opportunistic scavengers of technology, a race bound to the cycle of rise and ruin. They had outmaneuvered an empire that had ruled through manipulation and strategy alone. They had turned a species' own perfection into its downfall. That made them unpredictable. That made them dangerous. Across the stars, entire civilizations reassessed their stance on the newest players in the game of empires. Some saw opportunity, reaching out with tentative alliances, hoping to avoid being on the wrong side of history. Others, more cautious, prepared contingency plans, because if humanity had proven anything, it was that they could not be controlled. The question spread like wildfire across war councils and intelligence briefings. Was this the beginning of a new galactic order, or the prelude to something far worse? Not all Ulthari had accepted defeat. The remnants of their once glorious fleets drifted into the abyss, escaping beyond the reach of human patrols. Some surrendered, unable to fathom a world where the Dominion no longer ruled. Others, however, refused to yield. They vanished into deep space, entire squadrons retreating into the dark, silent and waiting. Rumors surfaced of a phantom fleet, an Althari faction unwilling to let history be rewritten. Their forces, scattered but not broken, regrouped in the forgotten corners of the void, whispering of revenge. No transmissions, no broadcasts, just the slow, methodical gathering of power, hidden behind the veils of lost star systems. Spies embedded themselves within human networks, seeking weaknesses. They studied their enemy, watching for arrogance, for complacency. Vance knew it wasn't over. He felt it in the way human fleets still patrolled with weapons primed, in the way intelligence reports always carried whispers of movements unseen. The war had ended, but the embers still smoldered. The enemy was waiting for a moment of weakness. It would come, and when it did, the next battle would not be fought in the open. It would be in the shadows, a war of ghosts. But even as humanity prepared for what was to come, there was another battle brewing, one they did not expect. Victory had come at a cost no one had yet measured. The Ulthari had built an empire on deception, on the art of psychological dominance. Humanity had not just fought them, they had learned from them. There were those who whispered unease, who saw the shift in human strategy and wondered if, in the pursuit of survival, they had become the very thing they had sought to destroy. The war had forced them to manipulate, to deceive, to weaponize perception itself. Had they won? Or had they simply changed? Vance had seen it firsthand. The way his officers had spoken in the final days of the war, the way tactics had evolved into something colder, sharper, the way humanity had adapted so ruthlessly that the Ulthari's own strategies had turned against them. War was evolution. But what if they had evolved into something they were never meant to be? He looked at the ruins before him, the drifting husks of ships, the remains of fleets that had once ruled the stars. The battlefield was silent now, but it spoke in the language of history, of cycles that had played out before, of empires that had risen and fallen because they had believed themselves in. He exhaled, his voice carrying not just through the remnants of his command, but into the unknown, into the listening ears of allies and enemies alike. They thought they were teaching us a lesson. His gaze lingered on the endless dark. But the real lesson, a slow breath, never bet against humanity.